everybody, Mr. Lamb again. This is unit, or not unit, now it's still unit 5, learning target number 9, finding the equation of a perpendicular bisector. So I have the 5 steps kind of mapped out. Again, a lot like segmenting or partitioning a segment. There are just some rules that if you can follow the rules step by step, it makes life really, really easy on you. So let's take a look at the 5 steps. Step number 1 says find the midpoint of the segment. All right? If you remember, a perpendicular bisector does 2 things. 1, it is perpendicular. Means it's going to be 90 degrees. It's going to have an opposite reciprocal slope. And if it is a bisector, then it's going to go through the midpoint. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take my segment and find the midpoint of that segment. That's going to help me with the bisector portion. The second thing I'll do is find the slope of the segment. The reason why I need the slope is because to write my new equation, I'm going to have to take the opposite reciprocal. And that's what step 3 says. Step 3, determine the slope of the perpendicular bisector by using the opposite reciprocal of the answer from step 2. Then in step 4, I'll use the slope form, the slope from step 3, and the point that I found in step 1, and plug the values into the equation y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. And then I will solve that equation for x. I'll rewrite it solving for y. So, best way to take a look at this is just look at a couple of examples with me and then work on a bunch of examples on your own. So the first thing I want to do is says find the equation of the perpendicular bisector of the segment with endpoints at 0, 8, and 4, 0. So step number 1, we said find the midpoint. So the midpoint, if you remember, and I'm just going to label like this. Here we go. So the midpoint is add up the x's and divide by 2. So 0 plus 4 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 8 plus 0 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. So my midpoint is at the point 2, 4. Number 2, find the slope of the given line. So the slope equals change in y. So 8 minus 0. And then the change in x, 0 minus 4. 8 minus 0 is 8. 0 minus 4 is negative 4, which reduces to negative 2 over 1. So find the midpoint, find the slope. Excuse me. Step number 3 is find the perpendicular slope. I want to call this slope, that little perpendicular sign. This just means I have to do the opposite reciprocal from my answer in number 2. So number 2 was negative 2 over 1, so the opposite reciprocal will be positive 1 over 2. Step 4 is I write the equation y minus y1. Now the y1 comes out of my midpoint. My y value of my midpoint is 4. Equals the slope, which is 1/2. We found that in step 3. Times x minus the x1 comes from the midpoint as well. That is 2. And then the final step, solve for y. So y minus 4 is equal to, I'm going to distribute my 1/2. 1/2 times x is 1/2 x. 1/2 times negative 2 is negative 1. Then I'm going to add 4 to both sides. And my equation is going to be y equals 1/2 x plus 3. That is the equation of the perpendicular bisector. So let me walk through it again. Step 1, find the midpoint. This becomes your x1 and y1 when we get to step 4. Step 2, find the slope of the original equation so that way I can get the opposite reciprocal slope in step 3. Step 4, use y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1 plug in my point from 1 as my x1 and y1, and my slope in line 3 as my slope. And then I just distribute and then add across and solve for y. Example number 2. Doing the same thing, but I just have a new set of points. There it is. So it says find the equation of the perpendicular bisector. So here we go. Step number 1, find the midpoint. So the midpoint, in this case, is x1 plus x2. 10 plus negative 6 is 4. Divided by 2 is 2. Add my y's together. 9 plus 3 is 12. Divided by 2 is 6. So find the midpoint first. This is now x1, y1. Number 2, find the slope of the given line. So my slope is rise over run. 9 minus 3, 10 minus negative 6. So I subtract my y's on top, subtract my x's on bottom. 9 minus 3 is 6. 10 minus negative 6 is 16. It reduces to 3 over 8. So step 3 is find the perpendicular slope. This is the slope that I need to use, and it has to be the opposite reciprocal. So my slope in line 2 is positive 3 over 8. So this is negative 8 over 3, opposite reciprocal. Step number 4, my equation, y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. So my x1 and y1 come from my midpoint. So what is the y value of the midpoint? It was 6, so that's y minus 6. The slope is negative 8 over 3, and x minus the x value of the midpoint is 2. And now I solve for y. So I'm going to distribute first. So y minus 6 is equal to negative 8 over 3x minus negative 8 over 3 times negative 2 is going to be positive 16 over 3. And then to get y by itself, I'll add 6 to both sides. So y is equal to negative 8 over 3x plus 16 thirds plus 6. Well, 6 is actually 18 thirds. Is 6. So 16 thirds plus 18 thirds is going to be 34 over 3. So, not very pretty, but effective. Again, if you are adding the fractions, if you're struggling with adding fractions in your head, it's okay. Use a calculator. You don't have to be a master of adding fractions in your head, but you should be able to use a calculator and add those fractions together. So, just a quick recap on what this unit was telling us. Just 5 pretty easy steps to find the perpendicular bisector. Step number 1 is find the midpoint. That is a skill that you had to have mastered in one of your first 4. Number 2, find the slope. That is a skill that you had to master in one of your first 4. Determine the slope of the perpendicular by doing the opposite reciprocal. That is a step that you had to do in your first 4. And then find the equation of the line from there. And that's a matter of plugging things in and using some algebra then to solve for y. So make sure that you know those 5 steps. Find the midpoint, find the slope, find the opposite reciprocal, plug into the equation, and solve for y. If you can do that, you're in real good shape in Unit 9. Have a great night.